good. Um, and I want to take a second before we start the actual presentation to say thank you for everyone that's coming. Everyone that's here is probably here listening because they probably have someone in mind whenever they're thinking about, reading problems and children specifically that are having reading problems. So I'll go ahead and get introduced so we don't take too much time. We're only going to talk for maybe 20 to 30 minutes on this, including answering some questions if anyone has any at the end. But just to introduce the topic, we're talking about focusing on reading and specifically the link between reading, learning, attention, and vision. A lot of people assume that if they have 20/20 vision, they have good vision, but there's a lot more our eyes and brain have to do together in order to read. So, my name is Jesse Willingham. A little bit about myself. I'm the doctor and owner at Brighter Outlook Vision, a specialty optometry practice in North Charleston, South Carolina, where we focus on vision therapy, which is what I did my residency training in at the SUNY College of Optometry in New York. Before that, I got my doctorate of optometry at the University of Missouri St. Louis, in St. Louis, Missouri College of Optometry. And before that, probably more relevant to today's talk, I actually got my Bachelor of Science in Cognitive Science and Psychology. Whereas a lot of people who before go into health fields, especially optometry, study biology, chemistry, and tracks like that, this background in cognitive science and psychology is really what set me up on taking an appreciation for development, psychological development, behavioral development in people, and how our eyes play a really major role in that. And so I really was happy to focus on that in optometry school. In our talk today, we're going to talk about vision development, how our vision develops as people. We're going to talk about how this has changed and how we've used our vision over the thousands of years that people have been around. And then we're also going to talk about how vision changes in the span of one lifetime, particularly just in those first few years when vision develops for the most part. We're going to talk about changes in abnormal things that can happen in vision development. We're going to take a break from vision specifically and focus just on the science of reading then, and after that be able to put the two things together and talk about how vision is linked to reading and learning. So to start off, let's talk about how we use our eyes. For many, many, many years, for the most part, humans use their eyes primarily to look far away in the distance. We needed to see far away to spot trouble, to find food, to do the tasks of day-to-day living. If you think about when we were farmers and things like that, we were not spending a lot of time indoors. If we were looking at things up close, it was for short amounts of time to make small tools to eat, really, minorly engaging things. But just a few hundred years ago, I think I skipped one. Just a few hundred years ago, we had the Industrial Revolution. And so as people started spending a lot more time inside, we learned trades and we had factory jobs. Not long after that, education became mandatory across, most of the developed world. This is great. Everyone now gets to learn to read. One downside for our vision, though, is where it was made to look far away and get lots of sunlight and day-to-day use in multifaceted kinds of ways. We're now spending lots of time looking up close, which isn't what our eyes are really used to or what they learned to do at a young age. Compounded today is the digital era where we're not just spending extra time up close, we're spending most of our time up close looking at two-dimensional screens and devices, really not what our vision is primed for. So you can see how that might create a lot of stress on our visual system in our day-to-day lives. So, primarily, you should know that vision is a learned process. We are not born knowing how to see how we see as adults. At birth, we generally have poor color vision. We have pretty poor visual acuity, which means our sharpness of vision, especially far away, is not great. We don't have any binocular vision really to speak of whenever we're born, meaning that our brain doesn't know how to use the two eyes together in a seamless way, like for most people whenever you're an adult. Now, our vision reaches a near adult level by the time we're at about a year old. The eyes start working together as a team. We get color vision and we get a lot more sharpness of vision, especially farther off in bigger distances. But our eyes are also learning how to see up close, to change focus from far away to up close, and to work together seeing far away and to work together seeing up close. But if you think about what a baby has to see, it's not as high a demand as what an adult does. Babies aren't driving cars, they're not reading, and so their visual system doesn't have to be as fine-tuned as an adult's, but it's already developed by that age. So it's not really until we get to school that our vision gets put to the test. If it's under stress, our visual system can respond in a few ways, just like there are several ways that humans can respond to stress in general. I want to take a second to talk about how humans respond to stress in general, not just in terms of vision, but in general. First, there's adaptation. So, over many generations, if generations are being subjected to the same stress over and over again, we'll see changes in our genetics. Adaptations will be passed down from generation to generation to better cope with our environment. After that, at a more granular individual level, we can have developmental adjustments that are responses to environmental stress. These can be interventional, so these can be things that, sorry, I didn't mean to go forward on that one. These can be interventional, so these are things like if you're developing teeth that aren't as straight as you want, you can intervene with that with something like braces. If you have scoliosis, so you've not developed the right curvature to your spine, but you have these sideways curvatures, you can intervene with something like a back brace. So we can change our development with different kinds of interventions. We can put them under a new stress to teach our bodies new things. We can have reactionary things too, so our bodies can take this into their own hands. In malnutrition, our body will stunt its own growth in order to try to survive. But in something that happens to everyone, our bone growth actually comes from the stress of compression. We live on a planet with gravity, and that sucks us down to the earth, and that compressive force stimulates our bones to grow at a young age. That's a necessary stress that our bodies have to go through development. So this developmental area is what we're going to mostly focus on today because that's what's most relevant to our visual system. But I do want to touch on the other ways that we can respond to environmental stress. We can acclimate to stress. So I like to use something like altitude as an example of this. If you live in a low altitude like we do here in Charleston, but you suddenly fly off to Denver, Colorado, you're probably going to feel that the air is a little bit different. But over time, you can acclimate to that. But when you come back to Charleston, you'll reacclimate to what you experience here with the amount of oxygen in the air. So altitude is something that we can acclimate to temporarily, but those are non-permanent changes. And then we can have behavioral and cultural changes. These are adaptations that we make as a society. My favorite example of this one is in the hot summer days, we have made a behavioral cultural change by adding air conditioning to our lives. And so this is the way we adapt to the environmental stress of hot summer days. But again, we're going to focus mainly on these developmental changes that we can experience. So the first possible response to this visual stress, the environmental stress on our visual system, is to overcome it. So once you go into school and you're subjected to that first environmental stress, it's going to put you to the test to see if your vision has developed to a high enough level to be able to do that. If it hasn't developed, you might still develop the proper coordination over time. My favorite example is eye tracking. We know that even though a lot of visual skills are not at full adult levels, by that first year, your tracking really is something that gets fine-tuned over the first several years. Like most other fine motor tasks, eye tracking is a fine motor task. So it has to follow your gross motor development, then come along with your fine motor development several years later. So that's going to improve over your age 6, 7, 8, all the way up to age 14. And so even though if that's not developed well enough, that can continue to develop really well. But what happens if the visual stress is too much on your eyes and they don't have a positive adaptation to it? Oftentimes we see physical changes to the eye itself. Just like compressive force can make a bone grow longer, the right kind of environmental stress can make the eyes change. The most common thing we see in this is myopia, which means nearsightedness. For most people that need glasses, this is the condition they have. They're nearsighted. Without their glasses, they can see okay up close, but they need them to be able to see far away. So this actually happens because the eyeball physically elongates. It doesn't stop growing whenever it's supposed to. And this is, in general, though there's a genetic component to it, thought to be a response to stress on the environment of needing to be able to see up close. Like I said, a nearsighted eye can see well up close, and it doesn't just see well, but it's easier for a nearsighted eye to see up close than a farsighted eye. And so it's a sacrificial thing our body does to take away that stress of seeing up close. Another fairly common example, 1% to 2% of people develop a lazy eye in the form of what's called amblyopia or strabismus. Amblyopia being one eye that is straight ahead with the other eye but doesn't see as well, or strabismus being the term for crossed eyes where one eye is straight but the other turns in or out. These are also physical changes to how the eyes respond and work together, and to be able to not see double in these situations, the brain changes how it processes the information from each eye and doesn't develop the normal wiring and structures to appreciate good binocular vision. This may not be bad early on. This prevents double vision and allows us to navigate. But later on, whenever we have higher demands for reading, we know those with amblyopia and strabismus typically don't read nearly as efficiently as those who have normal binocular vision. To see how near response and near vision is impacting these things, I like to look at the numbers for nearsighted Americans. In the 1970s, about 20 to 25% of Americans were nearsighted. They repeated these studies in the early 2000s and found the number had increased to over 40%. So this can't be a genetic change like we talked about in our different levels of adaptation. This has to be a developmental, environmental, responsive change. And it's a response to the fact that our environment is so much more centered around seeing up close today than it used to be. But this is really significant because really high nearsightedness can lead to eye health problems later on in life. So we need to look at things that can promote good visual health, reduce poor responses to visual stress to make sure we're maintaining good eye health throughout our life. Looking at our third possible response to visual stress, we look at more disorders that are around compensation for the stress. So these are the most common types of situations we'll see, second to myopia. So about 1 in 10 children will have some sort of inefficiency in the way their eyes coordinate. So in these types of children, typically what you're seeing is that whenever they're looking straight ahead in the distance, they do just fine. But when they go to turn their eyes in to look up close, it's such a stressful, unenjoyable, or sometimes even painful or uncomfortable task for them, or they just have such an inability to keep up with it for a long amount of time that they find ways to avoid this. It's not a very enjoyable thing. So usually what they'll do to compensate for it is, since the two eyes can't work together, they may lean forward and cover one eye up. To get a much bigger, more magnified image, they may hold things really, really close to try to read them right here. They're usually working so hard that it takes them hours and hours and hours to do all the work that they need to compared to their peers. They usually want to take a lot of breaks. They develop chronically poor posture from trying to compensate for so long. And because they're putting so much energy just into the physical activity of reading, they typically suffer in their comprehension afterward, because all the cognitive energy is trying to get the information in. They can't do anything with that information once they finally get it. The most common type of condition in this class is called convergence insufficiency, and it's one of the most well-studied conditions in this class, and it's one thing that we've found specifically there is a really good treatment for it. That treatment's called optometric vision therapy. They compared this to placebo and several other treatments, and vision therapy was the only treatment that was better than placebo. What's nice is convergence insufficiency is very, very analogous, and the treatment is very analogous across a lot of different modalities. So we can extrapolate that information to tell that vision therapy is going to be very beneficial for a lot of other similar conditions as well, without having to repeat the same studies over and over again. We can really use some critical thinking there and help. We'll talk a little bit more about vision therapy and how that can be related to children with reading issues when we're talking about the link between the two. Our final response, the fourth response, is sort of the final culmination of that third response, which is pure avoidance. In our compensators, they're developing poor posture, holding things close, covering up an eye to try to get through the work. But by the time they get to this stage, the work is so hard that they're actively avoiding it. They may develop, disruptive behaviors in class or become a class clown. They're typically really smart in some areas, but become really frustrated whenever things aren't easy and start to avoid those specific tasks. So you may not have any trouble getting them to do their math homework, but when it comes time to read the book, read the reading assignment, or do spelling homework, they don't have any interest in that. So this is where you start to see attention problems, and a lot of people will start to suspect ADHD, and that might be truly the primary problem. But children don't only have to have one problem. We know that children with ADHD are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with convergence insufficiency, and the opposite is true too. Children with convergence insufficiency, which we talked about before, are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. So there's a lot of symptomaticity between these two. You see a lot of the same problems. A really more advanced finding in this area is we're talking about really advanced ADHD. There was a study in California where an optometrist found that 90% of children in juvenile correction facilities have functional vision problems. These are things that can impact their ability to read clearly and efficiently. One of the best things I think about this study is that they actually found that by intervening with these problems, these children had a much much lower rate of recidivism. They were much less likely to be put back into the juvenile correctional facility if these vision issues were addressed. So it was a really good outcome. But it's very unfortunate. It's clear to see the link of a child who has a functional vision problem, who has a lot of trouble getting their schoolwork done, and then has a lot of trouble paying attention because the work is physically too hard for them to do, not mentally, but physically. They become disruptive, they get in trouble, sent to the principal's office. This becomes a really unfortunate cycle, which puts them into a more unfortunate position of being put into juvenile correction. So you can see just from this study alone, it really highlights the importance of finding these functional vision problems early and addressing them early. I wanted to take a step back from vision specifically and talk a little bit more about reading so we can learn enough to connect the two together. So there's been a lot of different camps in the science of reading over several years, and of course I'm a vision expert, so not a reading expert. So I take all of this and look at it through the lens of vision, but I think if I am working with people with reading problems, I need to at least be conversational in some of these things, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about it too if you didn't already know more than what I'm about to tell you about. So early on in the reading strategies, we learned about phonetics. This is our basic way of learning our letters, stringing letters together to make sounds. But this doesn't get us the ultimate goal of reading. Something that became popular several decades ago in several different school systems, but isn't pervasive throughout the entire educational system, is something called the cueing strategy. This is very interesting, and it has come under a lot of scrutiny lately because it really takes some of the skills of best readers and worst readers and combines them, and may not teach children to read very efficiently on its own. Really, some other lessons in decoding and phonetics are really crucial for this. But then finally we've landed on this term called orthographic mapping, which we think kind of describes how children truly do learn to read. So we talk a little bit about more of that. It starts with the phonetic and decoding, and then it moves that on to how we actually form sight words, or how each word becomes sort of an abstract concept in our mind. And so this is the sort of theoretical concept of that word coming locked in our memory so that we can recognize it every time we see it. And that's probably the most important thing I take from it here, is that when we talk about orthographic mapping, we're looking at how we read words from sight, because that's truly our most efficient type of reading. Our most efficient readers look at a page, they don't have to sound it out because they already know the word. They see the word, or actually usually groups of words all together. They take the meaning into it. They can be a little bit predictive on what's coming next, or things that they don't quite see as clear. They aren't straight ahead in their central vision. And that's where our cueing strategy comes in. It talks about predicting what's going to come next in the words based on context. And so they can use their vision purely to read. Our second most efficient readers still tend to do something called subvocalization. So they never make it to be a purely visual reader. They still use a lot of language. And the worst case end of this, they move their mouth whenever they read, which a young reader should still do before they fully develop their reading skills. But even many adults still read by saying it out loud in their mind. So they hear every single word that they're reading, which is obviously a little slower than being able to see it and more or less read at the speed of light, or at least the time it takes for the light to get from the page to your eyes. So there are three basic requirements to form this automatic type of reading. First of all, you have to know the sound. That's a prerequisite, so you have to have the decoding and phonics to sound out words. But then that has to become memorized, and you have to actually understand the meaning of the word too. So words can't be automatic if you don't know what they mean. And finally, you have to be able to remember what it looks like. And for me, this is where my ability to intervene in reading comes in. The first part, is auditory. The second part is language. But for me, this is the important part. It's vision. We have a few different very important visual skills we have to do when we're reading. Our eyes have to track from place to place together. They have to be able to focus, because we change the focus of our eyes just like a camera. A camera changes its focus. They're unfocused generally when we look off in the distance, and they tune in their focus to look up close. And then our two eyes point straight ahead in the distance, but then they have to converge in towards the center to read. And if all three of those things are not happening efficiently, then you won't see clearly, and you won't see clearly consistently. You may see double. You may see words going in and out of focus. You may read words and letters out of order, or skip words or skip lines, or reread words or reread lines because you're not tracking efficiently left to right. You may see things floating around or appear double vision or feel like they're swimming because they move on top of each other when the two eyes aren't teamed up perfectly. So all of those different conditions can stop this process of learning to read, remembering what words look like, and that can really get in the way. So that truly is our link between reading and learning. And vision, Vision is truly a complex process, but reading is even more complex. Reading takes skills from our language centers of our brain, our auditory centers, and our visual centers, and our visual memory centers, and puts it all together for a really, really almost magical process that humans are able to do. Children are even more complex, so there can be lots and lots of different things that can interfere with a child's ability to read. Vision is one of the most important factors to me because it's something that I can do something about for children and intervene with to help them with their reading. So, if you just look at the numbers, almost half the human brain is primarily dedicated to visual processing. Of all our sensory fibers that come through the brain, when we're talking about our touch sensation, taste, smell, hearing, 80% of all of those fibers are dedicated to what we see. My favorite number I think I look at all, because anytime we think about reading, we think about dyslexia, but we know that 79% of children with dyslexia also have functional visual deficits. And the functional visual deficits are something that can be resolved. And dyslexia is something that you have to typically cope with, accommodate for, learn strategies to get around. But with functional visual deficits, you can train those to be better. You don't just have to work around them. I like to take this moment to talk about a patient I had pretty early in my career, a little girl. We'll call her Sophie for the sake of the talk today. Sophie came to see us at our clinic when she was in 2nd grade. Sophie started off great at school in kindergarten, particularly in learning to read. She was learning her letters, she was putting sounds together. When she got to 1st grade, she was still an average reader and school was going okay. And when she got to 2nd grade, everything started going well except for reading for the most part. She hadn't advanced at all from her 1st grade level. So whenever it was recommended that her parents get her eyes checked out, she was suspected of having a functional vision problem, so she was sent to our specialty office. When we saw Sophie, we found that she had a condition called convergence insufficiency. We brought up this word a lot, and I just want to describe it a little bit more and kind of be repetitive with it since it is the most common thing we see. But in convergence insufficiency, when we look in the distance, our eyes are straight ahead, but when we go to look at something up close, like reading, our eyes have to turn in close together. For children with convergence insufficiency, they tend to not be able to turn the eyes in or turn them in long enough to be able to do things efficiently. Because the eyes aren't pointed in the same place, they start to see double. Sometimes, if it's been around long enough, the brain will ignore information from one eye and just start to use one eye to read, which is a very inefficient way to read. Sometimes this can even be very uncomfortable or painful for a child to make their eyes turn in for long enough to be able to read like they need to. But luckily, there's a treatment for convergence insufficiency. Sophie came to our office for optometric vision therapy. In her program, she came a couple times a week for a few months. And in the end, we considered her condition completely resolved. She was able to function as far as her vision goes at a completely age-appropriate level. She was able to get back on track with reading, and to this day, she hasn't had to go back for convergence insufficiency. That's really important because when we talk about conditions that are functional vision problems, these are all issues of coordination. They're not weakened muscles, so this is a skill that we haven't learned. But once you learn a skill, like being able to converge your eyes properly, it's not something that you have to keep practicing by doing exercises every day. You keep practicing that by reading and reading efficiently. Once it becomes the most efficient strategy for your brain to use, you'll always use it first. So this isn't something that you have to go back for year after year after year. It's something that can be resolved totally. Oftentimes, people don't know about vision therapy because there's a breakdown in communication between different areas. As a functional or developmental optometrist, I think about learning-related vision problems specifically, but I don't have a lot to say whenever it comes to specific learning disorders or learning disabilities. That's the camp of psychoeducationalists, so people who do testing for things like dyslexia. That doesn't mean that these are two different conditions that are mutually exclusive. Children can have one problem and another. Some can be addressed in certain ways and some can be addressed in others. The important thing for me is finding that child that has the vision problem and addressing that problem, but also making sure that they make it to the other individuals that can help them the most. Often children don't know how to communicate that they have these problems, so it's important that they are seen by multiple providers who are able to investigate very thoroughly and help them find the ways to talk about the problems that they're having so we can get to the root of what's keeping them from learning in school. So, my takeaway is that every child who's having trouble reading deserves a comprehensive, multifaceted consideration. They should be getting visual testing, I think, primarily because most testing that follows uses the visual system. So if you're already having trouble seeing, then you're going to, by default, especially have trouble on tests like psychoeducational testing, where they're looking at school achievement or IQ. We should also look into speech, auditory, and gross motor development, things like occupational therapy, speech therapy. There are dietary considerations too. This is one that's often overlooked, but just imagine if a child has a dietary sensitivity and you haven't identified it, they're going to have a lot of trouble at paying attention in school if they have an upset tummy most of the day. So, I want anyone at this talk to take away that there are lots of things that can impact reading and learning, but specifically, the development and function of your visual system can thoroughly impact your reading ability, but it can be improved with optometric vision therapy. If you know anyone or suspect anyone that might have one of these problems, you can go to covd.org. COVD is the overseeing body, sort of, for developmental optometrists. That's our main professional group. If you go to locate.covd.org, you can put in your zip code and you can find an optometrist who provides these services close to you. And then you can hopefully get at the root of what is affecting your child's reading and learning. And if it's vision, you can rest assured that it's something that can be addressed and improved. So I really want to take this time to thank everyone that came out to listen to the talk. Sorry if there were any auditory or visual issues. I know the screen freezes up from time to time. We're going to take a second and look at the comments. I don't know if there were any questions on anything. None at this time. But we will be posting this video to be seen at a later time. I also want to let everyone that's attending know that I'm going to put a link in the comments as well to a symptom questionnaire. If there's anyone that you suspect has some kind of vision problem like this, you can go ahead and go through that questionnaire, see if they're experiencing some of those problems to give you a better idea where to look next. Right? But I want to again thank everyone else for coming out tonight, joining us for this talk, and if anyone is going to need us in the future, we'll be happy to meet you soon. Thanks and good night.